Good afternoon, everyone. Like Deep, I hope you had a great weekend and great to be on the call with you again. So today we're going to talk about stationary energy as the main sector. So I'm getting a bit of feedback, but I'll continue. So we're going to talk about stationary energy. Before I do that, I just want to do a quick recap of last week's session, the session we had on Wednesday around calculating greenhouse gas emissions. So we looked at the different data we could use to estimate emissions. We particularly looked at the NEB report, the National Energy Balance Report, and we looked at the National Inventory Report, and we'll be using both of those today in one of our exercises. We then talked about how to deal with data challenges, and we looked at 4 different techniques to fill in any gaps in data. So where you have good data, but it's not perfect, you're either missing the right year or the right boundary, and how you can use the proxy approach, the interpolation, extrapolation, and overlap approach to deal with any data gaps that might happen. We then looked at notation keys, which is a kind of a tool within the GPC which allows you to report no emissions, but rather than leaving it blank, you use a notation key to indicate that those emissions either aren't occurring, they're included elsewhere, they're confidential, or they're not estimated. So it's a way of being more transparent. Rather than leaving a section blank, you give a reason why you're leaving it blank. So it's all about transparency and confidence in the data. We then talked a bit about managing data quality, and particularly around reporting data quality. And again, this is very important to give confidence to those who are using your inventory to understand how good the data is, but also for yourself to identify areas for improving the data quality over time. So we looked at how you assess data quality, either low, medium, or high. And again, that's not a scientific assessment. There's no one truth. That's your opinion as an inventory expert. It's for you to decide how good you think the quality of the data is, and to make that assessment. We then did an exercise at the end where you became the reviewer, and I asked you to spot 10 mistakes in an inventory. And these are 10 very common mistakes that we often see. Mistakes around misuse of notation keys, not adding basic or basic plus properly, not defining the boundary properly or fully, using different assessment reports to calculate or to convert methane and nitrous oxide into CO2 equivalent, not including all the gases. So those are very common mistakes we see, and hopefully for you, having had the chance to put yourself in the position as a reviewer, you kind of know what we're looking for and how to apply the GPC correctly. We have another 6 modules to go, so if you feel you didn't get all the 10 mistakes, that's no problem at all. That's why we're doing this training. But hopefully it gives you an idea of the kind of things you're looking for, and how to be a bit more critical about your own work and your own inventory. So before moving on to stationary energy, so we've now done 2 modules on the boundary and on calculating greenhouse gas emissions. The next 3 modules are going to focus on sectors. So today we're going to focus on stationary energy use in buildings, on Wednesday on transportation, and next week on waste, IPPU and AFOLU. So 4 webinars focusing on sectors, and then we go back, we sort of zoom out and we look at using the tools and applying your inventory. So before we continue, just want to pause for a second, see if there are any questions from anyone on modules A and B before we deep dive into stationary energy. So if you have any questions, please either use the chat box or feel free to speak up right now, and I'll give it a few minutes for us to take on any questions. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions for now, which is good, which hopefully means you'll understood what we covered last week, and it's still there. I'm not going to test you, so don't worry. But if you do have any questions throughout today's session, please use the chat function to raise those questions. If I can answer it straight away, I will. If not, I'll park it and I'll come back to that question when there's a good opportunity this morning or this afternoon for you to respond to your questions. So do please keep those questions coming. Okay, so module C or module 3 on stationary energy, we have 6 bits we're going to go through. A quick overview of the different subsectors. Then we'll talk about emissions from fuel combustion. We'll then cover fugitive emissions, and then we'll finally cover, in terms of the emission sources, grid supplied energy consumption. In other words, electricity, how you deal with electricity reporting in your inventory. I'll then show you some case studies, some very sort of high-level case studies of what other cities have done in applying their different approaches to calculating emissions from this sector. And then for most of today, we'll focus on a practical, and we'll use the workbook for that to show you how you'd apply some of those techniques and data sources. So that's the plan for today. What you will need for today is your workbook. This is your Excel workbook that we shared with you last week. But you also need 3 data sources, and one is the BER report, which is the National Inventory Report from Malaysia, the biannual update report to the UNFCCC, and we'll be using tables 1.15 and table 8 and table A2. You should have them. We shared this with you earlier, but they're also in the reference materials that we shared last week. So please make sure you have that accessible, because we'll be using data in those reports, and particularly from those 2 tables. We'll also use the National Energy Balance Report for 2017 and table 29 in that report. And finally, we'll use table 11 in a CDM report, which I've shared with you as well for 2017. So those are the materials that we'll need today. So please make sure you have them open on your browser or on your desktop, because you'll be needing them a bit later on today. So the workbook, the BER3 reports, the National Energy Balance Report, and the CDM reports are all sources we'll be using in today's exercise. Okay, so let's get started. I'm moving on to overview, and this is a quick high-level introduction to this particular sector. Again, today we're just focusing on stationary energy, which is one of the 5 sectors in the GPC, and one of the 3 sectors under basic. So this slide shows the different requirements for stationary energy between basic and basic plus, but also territorial reporting. So for basic, you need to report emissions from stationary energy sources and fugitive emissions for scope 1, and those from grid supplied electricity, steam, heating or cooling in scope 2. So scope 1 emissions is the combustion of fuel in buildings, and scope 2 emissions are those from the use of grid supplied electricity, steam, heating or cooling. For basic plus, there's an additional scope 3 source, which covers the transmission and distribution losses from grid supplied electricity, steam, heating or cooling. Whenever an energy source is part of a network, part of a distribution network, it loses some of its energy on the way, either in these big power lines you see dotting the countryside, or in heat pipes in case there's a heat network, which you often find in very cold climates, so it won't be applicable to your situation. But those are losses that take place outside the city, and they're covered by scope 3. So a basic plus source, we won't cover them today because they're basic plus and we're focusing on basic, but if you wanted to, it's quite easy to find an emission factor that quantifies the loss from transmission and distribution. So that's a city-induced framework. Remember, there are 2 frameworks in the GPC. There's city-induced, which covers basic and basic plus, and there's territorial, which just looks at emissions just within the city boundary. And so for territorial, in addition to all scope 1 sources, you're also reporting emissions from energy generation for electricity. So if you do have any power stations within your city, you need to report those emissions additionally as territorial. And we'll come on to that when we deep dive into electricity. But these are the basic differences between basic, basic plus, and territorial. So scope 1 and scope 2 for basic, additionally scope 3 for basic plus, and additionally in-boundary emissions for grid supplied electricity generation come under territorial. So next up, categorizing emissions. Again, we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 covers fuel combustion. So when you're burning fuel in your city, either gas, kerosene, or anything else, you're burning a fuel in your city, it is scope 1 source, because those emissions physically take place inside your city. Under scope 2, it's all consumption of grid supplied energy. And in your case, that will be electricity. So any electricity you consume is scope 2, regardless of where the energy is generated. Scope 2 is electricity. Scope 3, as I mentioned, are any distribution losses from the supply of electricity to your city. And that's often simply an emission factor you'd apply on top of your emission factor for the energy consumption. Okay, so moving into the subsectors. So we have the GPC, we have 5 sectors: stationary energy, transportation, waste, IPPU, AFOLU. Each of those sectors is broken down into further subsectors. And in stationary energy, we have 8 different subsectors. So we have residential buildings, which is I.1, and that covers all emissions from energy use in households. So 1.1 residential buildings, all emissions from households. 1.2, commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, covers all emissions from energy use in commercial buildings and facilities. This includes things like offices, shopping malls, garages, anything that is a commercial building or facility comes under 1.2. Additionally, we also have all public buildings come under 1.2. So any energy use in schools, in hospitals, in government offices, street lighting, or any other public facilities comes under 1.2. And remember, the GPC includes them in one single category, but the Common Reporting Framework asks you to break these down into 2 categories, into commercial and separately institutional. So they're together in the GPC, but broken down in the CRF. 1.3 is manufacturing, industries and construction, and this includes all emissions from energy use in industrial facilities and construction activities. For example, factories, building sites, anything to do with manufacturing or construction comes under 1.3. 1.4 is energy industries, and these are all emissions from the energy production and energy use in energy industries. So this is energy used on site. If the energy used is used to power or to generate power for electricity, it then comes under 1.4.4, which is reported separately from basic and basic plus. But if a power station has a small office or a kitchen and uses energy in that comes under 1.4. But any energy used to generate power directly comes under 1.4.4. 1.5 is agriculture, forestry and fishing activities. And these are all emissions from energy use in agriculture, forestry or fishing. And this is typically a farm, for example. It is not land use emissions. This is emissions from energy use. For example, if you're using energy within a farm, it will come under agriculture. 1.6 is non-specified sources, which is really anything else. And the CRF does not include 1.6 because it's not used at all. Usually you can find a sector for a subsector for that to come in, but the GPC allows a subsector called 1.6 for non-specified sources. But I would strongly recommend you don't use this subsector because it doesn't really add any information or any detail to your inventory. 1.7 and 1.8 cover fugitive emissions, and these are intentional or unintentional releases of emissions during the extraction, processing, storage, or transport of fossil fuels in the city. This is not the use of those fuels, but this is any releases from the extraction, processing, storage, and transport of those fuels. And there's one for coal, which is 1.7, and 1.8 covers oil and gas systems. But we'll come on to this in a bit more detail next. So this is what the GPC table looks like, and you've got the subsectors on your left: residential buildings, commercial and institutional, manufacturing, energy industries, energy generation, agriculture, non-specified sources, and fugitive for coal and fugitive for oil and gas. And you can see then the next 3 columns are scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. The green color refers to sources covered by basic, and this covers just scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. The blue color covers basic plus, and you'll see that covers those additional scope 3 sources. The gray means it's not applicable. Those emissions do not exist. So don't worry about those boxes because they don't exist. And other scope 3 basically means additional sources where you're tracking the full supply chain of those emissions. But we won't focus on those. That is sort of very advanced reporting, but it's important that you're aware of that those emissions exist, but we're not going to focus on those. So green is basic, blue basic plus, grey not applicable, and orange is other scope 3. You'll also see the pink one, and the pink one is territorial. This does not this isn't part of basic, but when we do the scope 1 total, we do include that one. And in this case, these are the emissions from any in-boundary generation of electricity that we don't include in basic, but we do include in that territorial total. So this is any energy that you generate in your city that gets shared with the national grid. We're already including that in consumption, so it will be double counting to count that under basic. Instead, we report it separately under this territorial total, which totals all scope 1 emission sources. Now, it's important that you understand the code and the language of the GPC. So I very rarely talk about, scope 2 residential. I say 1.1.2, or I say, for fugitive emissions from gas, I say 1.8.1. So it's important you become familiar with the language of the GPC, because we do tend to use jargon within any sort of sector or specialism. You begin to use the jargon and the language of the standard. So I would recommend that you begin to become familiar with these codes. So for residential buildings, it's 1.1, and then 0.1 for scope 1, 0.2 for scope 2, and 0.3 for scope 3. So for commercial buildings, it's 1.2, and then 1.2.1 for scope 1, 1.2.2 for scope 2, and that should be 1.2.2 for scope 3. And then we go down the list, the numbers increase. As we go across the list, the last digit goes from 1 to 2 to 3. So the basic principle is the last digit reflects the scope, except for the energy generation supplied to the grid within your city, which is 1.4.4. But everything else follows the same order. So we have 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 reflecting the scope, and then 1.1 is residential, 1.2 commercial and institutional, 1.3 manufacturing, 1.4 energy industries, 1.5 agriculture, 1.6 non-specified, 1.7 fugitive from coal, and 1.8 fugitive from oil and gas. So there's a question there, an example of a non-specified source. Can I share an example? So this is, I can't, but this really depends on, because I've never used it, which is why. But this is really, if there is something that doesn't fit into any of the other categories. So if there's an emission source that you really don't know where it belongs, you would then use a non-specified source. This is something more used at the national level than the city level, but because the GPC is based on IPCC, it is included. But I don't use it. I've never seen it used. But if there is something that you do come across, you think actually it doesn't fit in any of these existing categories, you can then put it under non-specified sources. But it's not really used for city level reporting. It's more a hangover because the GPC is based on national reporting, and they do have this additional category. Okay, so next up we're going to do a quick exercise, and this is to test your knowledge of these codes. So take a quick look, and we're then going to move into a Menti exercise to see how familiar you are with those codes already. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to open Menti again, so www.menti.com, and use the code 42265706. So menti.com 42265706, and I'll quickly share another screen. Okay, so let's get going. So again, this is just a test. Basically, I want you to think using the language of the GPC. So begin to think around the codes used in the GPC. If you get it wrong, don't worry. We have another 6 sessions to go through this. But this is just to make you think around using the different codes used in the GPC. Okay, so give yourself a name. Either use the name given or add your own name or make something up. But it looks like everyone's there. So let's get started. So air conditioner at home, would that fall under 1.1.1, 1.1.2, or 1.1.3? So air conditioner at home, is that 1.1.1, 1.1.2, or 1.1.3? Okay, the correct answer is, at least I have given, is 1.1.2. So air conditioner is often powered by electricity, which is a scope 2 source. So 1.1 indicates it's residential, but the 0.2 indicates it's a scope 2 source because it uses electricity. So that's why this answer I would have given is 1.1.2. So next one. A charcoal barbecue at a local food market. A charcoal barbecue at a local food market. Is that 1.1.1, 1.2.1, or 1.7.1? So 1.1.1, 1.2.1, or 1.7.1. Okay, and most of you got this right. This is 1.2.1. So a local food market is a commercial activity. So they sell the food, therefore it comes under commercial, which is 1.2. You're burning charcoal, which is a primary fuel, and you're burning it for energy. Therefore, it is a scope 1 emission source and not a fugitive source. It is you're burning the fuel, and therefore it's a scope 1 source, and it's a food market. Therefore, it is a commercial activity. So 1.2.1. Okay, next one. A diesel backup generator used at school. A diesel backup generator used at school. Is that 1.1.1, 1.2.1, or 1.7.1? Wow, full house. Congrats, guys. That's the first time we've had a full house. Really good. So diesel, it's a primary fuel there for scope 1, and school comes under commercial and institutional, so 1.2.1. Very good. Question 4. Electricity used in a car factory. Electricity used in a car factory. Is that 1.3.2, 1.2.2, or 1.6.1? Okay, and most got this right. It is 1.3.2. A car factory comes under manufacturing, so it's 1.3, and it's electricity, which means it's scope 2, so 1.3.2. Very good. Okay, 3 more. Street lighting. Is that 1.3.2, 1.2.2, or 1.6.1? Okay, and again, most of you got this right. Street lighting is a public service, so it comes under commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, and is powered by electricity, so it is a scope 2 source. So 1.2 is commercial and institutional, and the 0.2 is electricity, so it's 1.2.2. So 1.3.2 would have meant it was a manufacturing, a factory facility, but this is street lighting, which is often a public service. And 1.6.1 is non-specified, and street lighting is indeed a specified source because it comes under 1.2.2. Again, 1.6.1 we don't really use, and I would strongly encourage you not to use 1.6.1 because all activities in a city should be able to find a category within the GPC. Okay, so 2 questions to go. Sorry, three questions to go. Flaring at an oil refinery. This is a difficult question. Flaring at an oil refinery. So is that 1.7.1, 1.4.1, or 1.8.1? Flaring at an oil refinery. 1.7.1, 1.4.1, or 1.8.1? Okay, a mixed answer. The correct answer is 1.8.1, and I'll explain why. There are 2 fugitive sources, 1.7, which is for coal, and 1.8 is for oil and gas. So I think for those who answered 1.7, there are two categories for fugitive. Coal is just for 1.7 and 1.8 is focused on oil and gas. The reason it's not 1.4 because flaring you're doing without energy recovery. So there is no energy benefits. You're not generating any energy from it. You're just burning off excess fuel, and therefore it's considered a fugitive source because it's part of the extraction and processing process. You're not getting energy from it. It's not powering anything. It's not moving anything. It's just it's part of it's a waste product, and therefore it comes under 1.8.1. So flaring is a process of the oil industry, which is covered under 1.8, and it's not 1.7 because 1.7 focuses just on coal, and 1.8 focuses on oil and gas. Okay, 2 to go. Question 7. Coal combustion in a power station to generate electricity. Coal combustion in a power station to generate electricity. Is that 1.4.4, 1.4.1, or 1.3.1? Okay, and the correct answer is 1.4.4. The reason it's 1.4 because it's an energy industry. You're generating energy, whereas 1.3 is manufacturing and construction. So if you were manufacturing something, then it'd be 1.3, but because this is just power generation, it is 1.4. The reason it's 1.4.4 is because it is combustion to generate electricity. If it's combustion on site to heat a room, for example, or to for cooking within a power station, then it's 1.4.1. But because the purpose of this combustion is to generate electricity, which connects to a grid, it comes under 1.4.4. We'll explain this again in more detail. But so 1.4 because it's power generation, it's an energy industry, not a factory, not a manufacturing plant, and 1.4.4 because you're combusting to generate electricity, which connects to a bigger grid, and therefore it's 1.4.4. Okay, one question to go, and then we'll go back to the slides. Question 8. Lights on at City Hall. Is that 1.3.2, 1.4.1, or 1.2.2? Ooh, almost a full house. It is 1.2.2. Again, City Hall is a government building, therefore comes under commercial and institutional. It's a public building. It's a government office. So institutional building 1.2, and lighting comes from the use of electricity. Therefore, it is a scope 2 source. So 1.2.2. But well done, everyone. Next slide should show you who the winner is, who answered the most questions correct and the quickest. And that looks like it is Boaty McBoatface. So congratulations, Boaty McBoatface, Ribbit, and Frosty. Well done. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to plenary and share the screens. Perhaps if Boaty McBoatface wants to reveal themselves in the chat, so we know who that person is, that'd be nice. Okay, so we're going back. So these are the answers. You've got them here. I'll share this slide deck with you afterwards with the answers. Again, Nasha, she's on a roll. I think you got the last one correct as well. So well done. So the answers, I'll share these with you in the slide deck after the session. Obviously not before, because then you'd see the answers, but they'll be with you after today. Okay, so next up, thinking around data needs. So we've just looked through the different sectors, the different subsectors, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and these are the kind of data you might be using. I know this is quite small. So for residential buildings, electricity is used for lighting, appliances, air conditioning, Gas might be used for cooking or even heating, kerosene for lighting and for cooking, diesel as a backup generator, or biomass for cooking as well, or LPG for cooking. You don't tend to use oil within a residential building. For commercial and institutional, you typically have lighting, appliances, and AC using electricity. We have gas used for cooking and heating, either natural gas or LPG, and diesel being used as a backup generator. In manufacturing industries and construction, you'd have a lot of different sources depending upon what industry you have in your city, but often electricity, gas, diesel, oil, and LPG. I've sort of blanked out 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, and 1.7. They typically do not occur in cities. So we're not going to focus too much attention on these four. Big power stations tend to be outside city centres or outside towns, so they often don't make it into a GPC inventory. Agriculture, again, we're focusing on cities, urban areas. They don't tend to have a lot of agriculture. They may have some animals, but not huge agricultural activities. So again, that tends to be a very small source for most cities. Non-specified, again, we don't really use that one. And fugitive emissions from coal depend upon coal extraction, coal processing, coal transport. And again, that doesn't really happen within a city. So for those four sectors, subsectors, they don't really take place in a city. Do have a look at your own city and look at a map and identify the different industries, but often you'll find big power stations are located outside of city centres, away from people. Big farms, big forests, big lakes, you don't find them within a city either. Non-specified sources we don't really use for city reporting because everything can be allocated to a subsector, and often big coal activities, either extraction or transportation or processing, take place outside of cities. But then gas and oil systems, you do sometimes have these activities in cities. So often you do find some small emissions, some small fugitive emissions from gas or oil within a city. So this is broadly the data you'll be looking for. Again, for every city, this will be different, depending upon your own industries, your size of your city, the makeup, the use of the land. But for most cities, you'll be really focusing on residential buildings, commercial and institutional, manufacturing, and then in a very small amount, 1.8 focused on fugitive emissions from oil and gas. Okay, so next we're going to focus in detail on the different components. So starting with fuel combustion, and we're going to go through those first few sectors. So for residential, commercial, and institutional building facilities, these tend to be your uses. So under residential, you have houses and flats. Under commercial, you have retail outlets, shopping complexes, and office buildings. So your shops, your shopping malls, and your offices. Under institutional, you have schools, hospitals, police stations, government offices. And under facilities, you'd have street lighting, parking, public recreation areas, and a waste depot. So these are the activities, the buildings, the sources that would come under residential, as well as commercial and institutional. Again, an important note here at the bottom, the common reporting framework requires cities to report commercial separate from institutional. And the tool we'll be using, Cirrus, will do that for you. So just bear in mind, commercial is very much, it's anything you do to make money. It's a shopping center, it's a shop, it's a restaurant, it's a bar, it's an office, it's a coffee shop. Institutional is a public service, schools, hospitals, police stations, fire stations, government offices, city halls, anything funded by the public sector. And the facilities, which comes under institutional as well, you find street lighting, parking, public recreation areas, and the waste depot. There's a question there around fugitive, and I'll come on to that when we discuss fugitive. So I've seen your question, but I'll answer it a bit later on. So these are the main building types that come under 1.1 and 1.2. Sometimes, you have a building that has a multifunctional use, where you have residential at the, so they say commercial at the bottom and then residential at the top, or you have part of it is residential, part of it is commercial, part of it is public. So how do you then divide or allocate those buildings to one of those sectors? So you can either subdivide them based on the square meters of the buildings. So say if you have a building of 100 square meters and 25% is commercial, you allocate 25 square meters of the building to commercial and etc. So you can subdivide it based upon the square meter and then allocate the energy consumption according to the relative size of that use. You can categorize them according to their main usage. So if their main usage is residential, but they've got a small commercial element to it, then just categorize it to their main use and provide a very clear justification. And so that's the bottom one, and the middle one is according to the designated usage. If they have if they're used for say multiple things, but they have an official use, then use that official use, even though it's also used for other purposes. Use the official usage. If the whole building, it's has different uses, but it's difficult for you to separate them, then put them under one category, but obviously provide a justification. So again, this is very much for you to decide how you divide these based upon those 5 principles we set out earlier. What is most relevant for your city? What gives you the most accurate data? What is most complete? So think around some of those considerations and decide for yourself, is it worthwhile, really estimating the square meter of the different uses? Does that give me a lot of extra detail, or is it easier for me just to allocate it to one use and document it, provide that transparency, but just say, I'm going to give it to this one single use because it's easier and it doesn't have a big impact on the inventory. So again, for you to decide what the best use is for your city and for your inventory, given your time and resources and the purpose of your inventory and the amount of time you've got to do those calculations. So then moving on to manufacturing industries and construction. This is a very complicated sector because industry can be very varied and very diverse across cities, within cities. Luckily, a lot of this heavy industry takes place outside cities, but you will probably still find some of these within your city. So there is a breakdown you can see on the right, again, too small to read here, but you've got the notes in the presentation. The IPCC identifies 13 subcategories of industry. And if you can break it down using those subcategories, great. If not, then that's fine. But if you can, it's good because it just gives you a bit more detail. And so we're looking at the iron and steel industry, non-ferrous metals, the chemical industry, pulp, paper and print, food processing, beverages and tobacco, non-metallic minerals, transport equipment, machinery, mining, wood and wood products, construction, textile and leather, and non-specific industry. So if you can break it down by those, great. If you can't, don't worry. You can always group them as a single manufacturing industry sector. But emissions in this sector come from boilers, on-site furnaces, on-site power generation to directly propel and power these industries, burners, turbines, heaters, incinerators, engines. These are all this is all equipment that consumes primary fuel and tends to use a lot of energy to power industry and construction. So we've got a sort of a further breakdown here. So this is 1.3 manufacturing industries, and we're now moving on to 1.4, which is energy industries. And we've got a number of different activities here. We have primary fuel production comes under an energy industry, which is coal mining or oil and gas extraction. And this is the energy used to mine the coal or to extract the oil and the gas. So it's not the burning of the coal, it's not the burning of the oil and gas, it's the extraction, it's the energy that's used to extract those fuels. Again, you rarely find a coal mine within a city centre or within an urban area, but you may have in some places. But so this is primary fuel production, the energy used to mine a coal or to extract oil and gas. The second activity is fuel processing and conversion, and this is the energy used to convert, say, crude oil to petroleum products in refineries, or coal to coke in coke ovens. So this is where you're processing a fuel to make it useful by other people, by other industries, or by other factories, for example. So it's the processing, the energy used in processing the fuel. It's not using the fuel itself, it's the energy used to process the fuel. The final one is energy production supplied to a grid, which is energy you burn to generate electricity, or combined heat and power, or district heating or cooling, or any other sort of on-site energy use before you go to a grid. So under 1.4.4, you get that last one. So any energy generated and supplied to the grid is reported as 1.4.4. But any energy used to produce energy or to process energy, to extract it, is 1.4.1, 1.4.2, or 1.4.3. So a very important distinction. Any energy used where you're not generating energy is 1.4.1, 1.4.2, 1.4.3, mostly 1.4.1. But energy used to generate electricity and supply it to a grid is reported under 1.4.4. So a very important distinction. But basically just think of, is the energy being used to generate electricity? If yes, 1.4.4. If you're using any energy to extract a fuel, to process a fuel, then it comes under 1.4.1 mostly. So that's energy industries, and a key distinction there between energy being used on site for extraction, for processing, but any energy used to generate electricity is always 1.4.4. So then moving on to 1.5, which is agriculture, forestry, and fishing activities. And you might think, well, actually, isn't there an AFOLU sector that covers this? Yes, there is. The AFOLU sector really covers emissions from land. And this subsector covers emissions from the use of energy. So it's it covers direct fuel combustion in agricultural activities. So this is anything. So if you're operating machinery, if you're generating sort of lighting or pumps or heaters or cooling or others, that typically is what we mean. So any off-road vehicles and machinery used on site is covered under Station Energy 1.6. Any on-road transportation on a farm, and on-road I mean on a public road, like a tractor comes under transportation. But if it's machinery for a farm that just takes place on the farm, it comes under stationary. So any emissions on the farm, off-road, from vehicles or machinery comes under 1.6. If it's an on-road vehicle like a tractor, it would come under transportation sector. Anything to do with land use, so any agricultural residues, so any crops that you're burning, or any manure management or livestock emissions, they come under AFOLU. So under 1.6, all we report is emissions from the use of energy in farm vehicles or machinery, things like pumps, things like lighting or heating or coolers, comes under 1.6. But as soon as it's a vehicle that can go on a public road, it's under transportation, because it's a road vehicle, it's on-road transportation. And any emissions to do with the land itself, with crops or with livestock, comes under the AFOLU sector. If you have no farms in your city, or you have a very small fishing activities, this won't be a big source. If you do have farms or a big fishing industry, then these emissions could be quite big. Okay, so those are the main combustion sectors. And next we'll focus on fugitive emissions, and this is quite a tricky sector, and I'll respond to the question as well once I've gone through the slides. So fugitive emissions, it's always a very small proportion, but sometimes emissions are released during extraction, transformation, and transportation of primary fuels. So it's never the use of the primary fuel, but it's the extraction, transformation, and transportation of those primary fuels that often results in releases of gas. For example, if you're mining coal, then as you're bashing open those seams, some small bits of gas gets released. That is a fugitive emission. It's an emission that happens as part of the extraction process. It's not intentional, it's not unintentional, but it just happens. So there are bits of methane trapped in these seams, and when you open them and break them up to extract the coal, those gases escape. And then as you further process it, you further break down the coal, those bits of gas escape as well. So that's why it's a fugitive emission. It is something that just happens. It's not significant, but it's not related to the use of the fuel. It's part of the process of extracting, transforming, or transporting the fuel. For oil and gas, often you'll have these refineries where you're flaring gas to get rid of it. Oil and gas are also, they evaporate very quickly, and this is why when you're at a petrol forecourt, a petrol station, you can always smell the oil. That's oil evaporating. It's releasing itself. So there's always small amounts of oil and gas kind of seeping into the environment through evaporation, through leaks in equipment. So if you have sort of spillage at a petrol station or in industry, that's also not intentional, but that gas will eventually evaporate. If you're flaring it, if you need to vent it, which is basically a release of the gas without flaring it, then those come under fugitive because you're not burning it for fuel, but you're just letting it escape. And again, these tend to be very small. It's often part of a process. We know these occur, but they just happen because that's part of the process. You can make improvements to make it more efficient, but you can't necessarily eliminate it. If you have any refineries in your city boundary, there will be fugitive emissions. So you'll need to speak to those refinery industries to understand how much they're flaring and what they estimate those losses to be. Quite often, when you have a gas network in your city, usually natural gas for cooking or for heating, particularly in cold climates, which is connected by a network of pipes, there'll be small holes in the network, and some of that gas will escape. And again, that's a fugitive emission source. If you're filling bottles of LPG, for example, as you're filling them, there's often again releases. So that's fugitive emissions. They tend to be very, very small. So unless you have a huge amount of gas or oil you use in your city, then this will be very insignificant. But if you do have a big gas distribution network, you have oil refineries in your city, then these will likely become more significant. So look at your city, decide, do I have a big coal industry? Yes, no. Do I have a big oil industry? Yes, no. Do we have a gas network? Yes, no. And that will decide whether you should explore or look into the need to measure fugitive emissions. So the question is, how about underground gas distribution piping inside a city? So do we need that data also if the piping only passes the city? So sorry, I thought your question was related to fugitive emissions, but I'll answer both. So any underground gas distribution will always involve leakage. You can never make a piping leak free. So if you do have a big underground network, you should include fugitive emissions, and they take place inside your city. So regardless of whether you're using that or not, if it passes through your city, those fugitive emissions might take place in your city. Therefore, you should capture them definitely. It's more difficult, and they might be very small. So then decide if it's worthwhile your effort to collect that data. But if those emissions take place in your city, you should definitely capture them. But if it's a small part of your city, then the emissions will be insignificant. And again, look at those principles and decide, is it worthwhile? Is it relevant for me to collect this data? Is it going to improve the accuracy of my data? It may be slightly, but not a lot. So in that case, I probably wouldn't. But yeah, first of all, is to decide how big is that network, and are the accidental releases, the leakage, is that likely to be significant or not? Question whether this applies to renewable energy industries as well. And I take that's previously. If it uses fossil fuels, then yes. If it doesn't, then it doesn't form part of your inventory, because your inventory is only concerned with fossil fuel, with emissions of greenhouse gases. They don't occur from renewable energy, therefore you don't need to include them. If, however, you have, say, some some wind turbines, and there's a house there, and occasionally it uses there's a kind of an office there, and that uses power for heating or for cooling or for cooking or for lighting, then yes. But the actual energy generated by wind turbines, solar panels, hydropower, you wouldn't report those because they don't use fossil fuels, therefore they don't release greenhouse gas emissions. But if they do use any fossil fuels either on site or through electricity themselves to either keep things going, then yes. But it's based upon the combustion of fuel or energy that comes from fossil fuels. So generally, you wouldn't report energy from wind farms or from solar panels or hydropower as such. And again, another question. Sorry, I'm just seeing this. I'm seeing these a bit late. Biofuel for transport, is that under transportation? Yes, and we'll come on to that at the next session. So Fugitive, very small. Ask yourself 3 questions. Do we have any coal activities in the city? Any processing, storage, or transportation? If yes, talk to the industry and understand what the activities are and what the emissions are. If no, a big NO, not occurring. Do you have a big oil industry in your city? Is there a refinery? Is there flaring taking place? If yes, talk to the industry. If not, NO for not occurring. Do you have a gas network in your city? If yes, again, talk to the industry or find an emission factor, because that's often a very common source of fugitive emissions. If you don't have a gas network, or you have a fairly small and managed sort of LPG system, then a big NO, because they're unlikely to be significant. So again, look at your city and decide, is this likely to be significant or not? And if it is, talk to an expert. If not, then simply use NO for not occurring. But these will be very small, but nonetheless, they do make part of an accurate and complete inventory. Okay, so now moving on to grid supplied energy consumption, and we'll take a break after this session. So grid supplied energy consumption is scope 2. And we say grid supplied energy because we refer to different types of energy. We refer to anything that's connected by a grid. In most cities, this will be just electricity. But in some cities, you have an underground network where you distribute steam, heating, or cooling. I don't think that's the case for any of your cities, so we'll just focus on electricity. But in a number of cities, particularly in Northern Europe and North America, you have an underground heating network where you distribute heat to homes rather than having individual boilers or heaters, for example. So, but for now, I'm just going to focus on electricity. But the GPC talks about grid supplied energy because that covers electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. But for your cities, this will mostly be electricity, which is used in homes, offices, other buildings, and for outdoor lighting. So the reason it is scope 2 is because it is part of a regional or national grid, and that means you never quite know where the energy comes from, because there could be, say, 10 power stations producing your electricity, but you never know which one it's coming from because it's part of a grid. It's all shared and it's all mixed together. So you can't point it directly to one particular power source. It's part of a network, part of a grid. And that's also why even if you have a power station inside your city, you can't guarantee that your energy consumption, your electricity comes from that particular power station, because it's part of a much bigger grid. And therefore, all electricity use comes under scope 2, because you can't say exactly which power station it comes from, whether that's in your boundary or outside your boundary. It's all reported as scope 2 emissions. Now, there are 2 ways to calculate emissions from electricity. There's the location-based approach and there's the market-based approach. To be clear, the GPC only allows you to use the location-based approach, not the market-based approach, but it's important that you're aware of both methodologies. The location-based approach is based on the average energy generation emission factor for defined locations, including local, subnational, or national boundaries. So what it does, it basically looks at all the sources, all the power stations that make up your grid, your regional or your national grid, and estimates an average emission factor for the whole grid. And that could include some green power from wind farms or solar panels. That include coal from coal-fired power stations or oil and gas from other power stations. But it looks at the average across all the locations connected to your network. Now, the market-based approach, because sometimes energy companies will sell you a green tariff. They say, if you pay a little bit more, we'll guarantee to supply your energy with green energy. Now, they can't actually guarantee that the energy you get comes from a power station, comes from a wind farm or a solar panel, but they can basically make sure that for whatever energy you're consuming, they're generating the same amount from green sources. And so you're paying a small additional tariff to make sure that they're generating as much green energy as you're using, but you can't guarantee that the electrons that are coming into your house come from that wind farm or come from those solar panels. What the market-based approach does, it says, actually, based upon my contract, what I'm paying for, if I'm paying a green tariff, then I would assume it's got lower carbon emissions. So the market-based approach looks at your emissions based upon the tariff you're on or the energy you claim to be buying, but it's based on an offset. It's based upon someone else purchasing or generating an amount and then selling it to you, but it's part of a network that all gets mixed up together, and you can't guarantee that the electrons coming into your house actually come from that wind farm or that solar panel. So, but it's a way that companies often use, and they buy green tariffs, say, look, we're carbon neutral because we buy a green tariff. The actual electricity they're using could still be grey, as we call it, from coal or gas, but they're buying the same amount elsewhere to offset their emissions. The GPC only allows you to use the location-based approach. So you have to base your emission factor for electricity on the network you're part of and all the power stations connected to that network. And you can't sort of play around and choose one because, say, for example, if your city hall, your government decides to buy just energy from wind farms, you can't then say, actually, all our emissions are zero from electricity because we're buying energy from wind farms. You may be through the market-based approach, but the GPC asks you to use the location-based approach, which looks at the actual grid emission factor for the whole grid that you're connected to. Now, if you're using, say, solar panels on your buildings, then they won't be included because they'll actually be used directly, and they're not connected to a grid, but they're being used directly by your buildings, and so they serve to reduce your demand. But they don't change the emission factor that you would apply. They just reduce your demand for grid supplied energy. So how to calculate grid supplied energy emissions? So you can use real consumption data. So this would be, say, the tariff you get from your energy company. You can obtain that data, and particularly for your government buildings. That data will be available because your government will be paying for that energy, and therefore you can obtain that data. You might get it for residential buildings and commercial buildings as well from your energy company. So always contact them to see, do you have actual consumption data? Because actual consumption data is the best data there is. If it's only available from a few utilities, you can say get a representative sample of data and scale it up for your whole city. So if you only have data for say 10% of your buildings, you can then apply, say, multiply that by 10 to cover your entire city stock. You can use end-use energy intensity figures. So, for example, if you know the space that's used by your buildings in square meters, you can use average energy intensities. So, for example, kilowatt hours per square meter for different industries, and those figures are often fairly well available. You can then apply those to your sort of square footage area for different buildings. You can look at other data, other cities, or you can scale down national data. You can adjust it for different years. You can model the data based upon your energy type. So different ways of actually collecting that data, but the best data is always measured data from your energy company. So always have a conversation first with your energy company or your Ministry for Energy to see what data is available that they can share with you. If that isn't available, then you need to look at different approaches, either scaling data or looking at energy intensity figures etc. The emission factor often comes from national governments, and they tend to report this very well. There are also international data sets that give you emission factors, but that's often quite easy to collect. The more difficult thing is to collect the consumption data and particularly have it broken down by different building type, because the GPC requires you to break it down by residential, commercial, public, industry, and energy industries. So try and get that broken down. If not, you might need to make some assumptions based upon the proportion of space used by different building types, or the GDP, for example. So we'll then get into scaling. But if you can always get the right data from the utility, that's your best data possible. Okay, so transmission and distribution losses. So as I mentioned, when energy travels, it loses energy, just like us. If we start running, we're more tired at the end of it than when we started. Same with energy. When it's being transported, it loses some energy on the way, typically between 5 and 20%. But it loses energy on the way depending upon how far it travels and how it travels. So, for example, if I cycle a short distance, I'm not going to be very tired. If I run a marathon, I'm going to be very tired. So the longer it travels, and also looking at the type of how it travels, it will lose energy. Those losses are called transmission and distribution losses, and they occur because energy generation often takes place far away from where people live. This is to avoid any air pollution or noise pollution, or they need a lot of space and it's cheaper outside the city. But there is often a need to travel from the power station to your house through cables and wires. And as part of that, it loses some energy. Now, those emissions, again, because power stations are often outside the city, they're categorized as a scope 3 source, because the majority of the distribution network will take place outside your city. So the GPC allocates this as a scope 3 source. To calculate those losses, there is typically a grid loss factor, which is a percentage of loss that happens through the transportation. And you can get that from your national government. You can get that from industry sources, from journals. This is fairly easily available online. So you basically estimate the total energy consumption, and then you apply a grid loss factor, again, typically a couple of percentage points, and then you apply an emission factor to that. So the calculation at the bottom is the activity data, which is basically all your energy consumed from the grid, multiplied by the grid loss factor, which gives you the energy that you lost, and then multiplied by the emission factor is how you calculate those emissions. But this is a basic plus source. We're not going to address this during these webinars because it's a basic plus source. But if you wanted to include this to make it more complete, and maybe if you wanted to go for basic plus, then just bear in mind that energy loses some of its power, some of its energy on the way from the power station to your house, to your office, to your shop or your restaurant. And the level of loss is known as a grid loss factor, which is a data point you can get from national government. And you simply apply that to your consumption to know what the loss is. Okay, so then just one more slide, which looks at the relationship between energy generation and energy consumption. And I'll go through each of these points individually. So cities may have energy generation facilities inside their city boundary. But again, in most cases, you can't prove that energy consumed in your city is supplied by your city. And so in bold here, cities cannot assume that their energy consumption from regional grids is met in full or in part by energy produced within your city boundary. So again, you can't guarantee where the electron comes from that goes into your TV, into your air conditioner, into your lighting. That could come from a power station in your city, but it could equally come from a power station 300 kilometers away from your city. And for this reason, because you can't guarantee exactly where it comes from, and that depends upon demand, upon time of day, upon network balancing. So there's lots of variable factors that decide where those electrons go. For that reason, again, and I have to remind you of this, all scope 2 emissions from grid supplied energy, electricity, are reported together and they're not separated. So scope 2 emissions is all your demand, all your energy consumption from electricity, and then you have that 1.4.4, which allows you then to report any separate emissions from any in-boundary power station. So 1.4.4 is in-boundary power generation, but that's not part of basic plus or basic. And then separately to that, we report all energy consumption of electricity under scope 2. This is the biggest mistake people make in compiling an inventory. So be very clear on this. All electricity use is assumed to come from a national grid and comes under scope 2. If you do have any power stations in your city, report them separately under 1.4.4. And then finally, just the difference between the GPC and the CRF. So the GPC basically asks you to report territorial emissions, which isn't part of your basic or basic plus framework, and so therefore it avoids double counting that way. And the CRF basically also asks you to report emissions from in-boundary power stations separately. So again, Cirrus, the tool we're using, will do that for you, but both basically ask you to report separately on emissions from in-boundary power generation that is not added to your total emissions for your city, but it is reported for transparency. In addition, and this is very important, the CRF also asks you, and it's written in bold here, is to report emissions from in-boundary power generation, but also any facilities outside the city that the city controls or can influence. You need to report those emissions separately. So if your city, and this rarely happens, but it does, if your city owns a power station, either wholly or partly outside your city, you should also report that separately under the CRF. And that's done because you have some influence over that power station. So again, it doesn't count towards your inventory total because it's not based upon your energy consumption. But if your city does own a power station outside the city, then you should report that separately as part of the common reporting framework. But again, that doesn't happen very often. It's a few cities I know that have that. Most cities do not own any power stations outside their city. But if you do, then report it separately as part of the common reporting framework. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop. And I think that was quite a lot to get through already. So quite a lot of content we've gone through now. Next, we're going to move into some exercises, some more practical exercises. But I'll hand over to Deep to start the break, and then I'll join again after the break.
I have a question on the emissions on energy generation, right? So
Yep.
assuming there is a coal power plant within a city's boundary, right? But it's supplying electricity to the grid, right? So which is part of the Malaysian grid, right? Will that be part of the scope 1 combustion, or will be territorial emissions?
Yes, that would be part of 1.4.4, which is the territorial emission. So you report it under 1.4.4, which means it's reported as a scope 1 emission source, but it's just counted towards territorial and not counted towards basic.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I know that was a lot of content to get through, but we've got quite a few exercises coming, which will give you a chance to really interrogate the data, interrogate those different subsectors, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, etc. So there'll be plenty of chance for you to become more familiar with those different sources. I'm going to give you now 3 case studies, very high level case studies, just to get an idea of what different cities are doing to get data and to estimate these emissions. Before I do, let me just pause for a second to see if there are any questions from any of you based upon the content I've just covered. So based on any subsectors, any scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 allocation. So yeah, any questions before?
Michael, I have one question.
Go. Yes, please.
So if, say for example, a power plant does do carbon dioxide captures or removal in their power plants, do we have to account for that as well in our inventory?
You would, yes, but typically
Okay.
that should be reflected in the emission factor. So if there's a carbon capture facility, then that would usually be reflected in the emission factor for that particular power station or for the national grid. So I don't expect it's something you would have to estimate yourself. but you want to check that it's reflected in the emission factor.
The reason I ask is because sometimes for the dry ice producers, those who requires carbon dioxide, so it's based on demands. It's not always the same production, so, and which is why if well, it won't be reflected on the emissions factor, and that's the case. Am I right?
No, yeah. It's so the GHG works only when emissions are released. So if emissions are captured, you don't report them until they're released. So if there is carbon capture, but then it's sold as dry ice or another product that then is released, then when it is released and where it is released is where you would report it. So in that case, it comes under it's use of a product. But if until the point where it's released, you don't report it. Only when it's released is when you would report it. So if there is carbon capture, that could be a temporary storage, but you would then report it when it's released and under the sector where it is released at.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so any further questions, again, please use the chat function or speak up at any time. But if there are no further questions, then I'll continue with the case studies, and then we'll move into the exercise. Okay, so just a few case studies, just to get you thinking around what other cities are doing. So these are 3 examples focused on the residential sector, 1.1.1 and 1.1.2. And we're looking at data quality going from low to high. So in Cape Town, what they did is to estimate paraffin use is they had a figure for the average gigajoules used per household, and they multiplied that by the number of households. So a very simple approach. It's not wrong, but it may not be entirely accurate. So that's why it's low quality. But you have an average intensity, an average energy use figure per household, per person, per square meter, and you apply that based on the whole population to your city. In Stockholm, what they did is they had total energy use data, but they didn't have it broken down by building type. So they broke it down into subsectors based on floor area of buildings. So that total energy, and they knew, for example, say shops is 5%, restaurants is 10%, public sector is 50%. So they used based upon your floor area. They broke down the data into subsectors. That won't change your total emissions for your city, but it will affect how you break it down between subsectors. So while it might still be accurate at a citywide level, at a subsect level, because you're making an assumption here, it's going to be less accurate. And London, they got all their energy use data from a supplier, broken down by user. So they had the total energy used by the city broken down by residential, by commercial, by public sector, etc. So they had really good data collected by the energy companies to give them that breakdown already. So again, going from low quality to high quality, and generally as you take fewer assumptions and as it's more based on actual data, the data quality increases, in this case from Cape Town, which is based upon a very simple model, average use per building, per person, per household, to actual measured data broken down by user, which is the best data you can actually get. So looking at energy generation 1.4.4, again going from low to high, and this time London is low and Copenhagen is high. So London, they had an expert identify power stations within the city, and they estimated their capacity, the fuel type, and the load factor. So the data wasn't available. Contacting the energy companies wasn't proving to be very useful. So they simply identified the power stations in the city based on the size and some information online, estimated capacity, assumed a full fuel type, and estimated load factor, how often it is working. So a lot of assumptions in there. Again, not wrong, but nonetheless, a lot of assumptions. Mexico City used activity data from the company report submitted to the Environment Secretary. So this is where big energy companies report to the national government, and they used that report to estimate emissions and used IPCC emission factors. And again, the use of IPCC emission factors makes it medium quality because it's not specific to the power station, but is a general emission factor. And Copenhagen, actually, they own their energy company, and so they they have all the data they need that they generate and what fuel they use, etc. So they have all the data, and that's measured data. It's broken down by fuel type, etc. So the best data you can find is that data. But there are different ways of estimating emissions. Again, none of these are wrong. They're all relevant. Some maybe Copenhagen is more accurate because it has fewer emissions or fewer assumptions, and is more based on actual measured data. So the final example is focusing on fugitive emissions, and in this case we're looking at, so all these cities have a gas distribution network. They use natural gas at home for heating and for cooking, and they have 3 different ways of calculating their emissions. In the case of Washington, DC, they looked at total gas consumption and then applied an IPCC emission factor to that. So again, bear in mind, IPCC are often global factors, and countries differ a lot, and cities differ even more. So it's fine to use it, but it won't be accurate because there's a global factor applied to one individual city. Then next I'm going to go to New York, and in this case, the gas operator took a series of measurements. They went around the city and measured how much gas was escaping from the network, and then extrapolated that across the city. So it's based upon a physical measurement, but then modeled out across the whole city. And then in San Francisco, in the middle, they said, look, IPCC it's a global factor. It's not going to be very relevant to North America, but we don't want to measure it ourselves. We think we're like New York, but maybe we're a bit more efficient than New York, because New York's an older city than San Francisco. So what they did is they looked at total gas consumption multiplied by the New York emission factor, the one that New York had calculated themselves. But then they said, actually, we think we're a bit better than New York, so we're going to multiply that by 0.8. And again, that was their decision. It was based upon their own judgment. There's no science behind that 0.8 figure, but they said, look, we have a good figure from New York based upon actual measurements. We think we're similar to New York, but maybe slightly better because we're not quite as old. Therefore, it's 0.8 rather than 1. And again, all of these are valid. They're just different ways of answering the question, which is basically how big are your emissions. And this really goes to, I think, one of the key skills you need to have as an inventory compiler. It's problem solving. You're solving a problem, which is basically to estimate emissions, and you want to do it as accurately as possible, but also knowing that, because San Francisco, they could have taken the measurements themselves, but that would have costed a lot of money, taken a lot of time, and wouldn't have been that useful because these emissions tend to be fairly small anyway. So they looked at, well, what can we do? We can use IPCC emission factors. They're okay, but they're global. We can use New York's emission factors, but our cities are slightly different. Well, then why don't we apply a factor to that New York factor to make it more relevant for San Francisco? So you're always thinking around, well, what data can I use? Can I use that? Can I use that? Is that better? Is that better? Or how do I make sure it fits my boundary and reflects my city? So a few examples here to really get you thinking around different ways that cities are currently collating data and where they're getting it from, and how they're formatting the data to fit their own city boundary and their own city conditions. Any questions on these examples?
Michael?
Yes.
I have one, but it's not really related to the example that you gave just now, but this is regarding the energy generation using biomass. Mm-hmm. So does it emit emissions at all? Because in the GHG protocol, they do not have a consensus method to measure that. So is it for GPC is regarded no emissions?
And the answer is yes. So the GPC assumes that any burning of biomass is not counted, because the emissions released from the burning of biomass then gets sequestered when the biomass grows again. So the assumption is what we call biogenic carbon is not included in your inventory, because it's been sequestered, and it's got a fairly short life cycle before it gets sequestered again. So and therefore there's a distinction between fossil carbon and biogenic carbon, and the GPC only measures fossil carbon and not biogenic carbon. You can report biogenic carbon, and we would encourage you to do so, but it doesn't get added to your GPC total because it's considered that those emissions will be taken out of the atmosphere fairly quickly by further growth of trees and other forest products. However, if you're clearing land, if you're taking trees down, using the biomass and clearing land, and it's a irreversible loss of that biogenic carbon, then you do report it. But if it's assumed that, say, it's pellets for a biomass incinerator, then the assumption can be that carbon gets captured again. You don't report it. If it's an irreversible loss, so deforestation, you do report that because that doesn't get captured back into the ground. But the basic principle is biogenic carbon can be reported. You don't have to, but you can report it, but it doesn't get counted towards your emissions total.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for clarifying.
Hi, Michael. I have a question. This is regarding your slide number 32.
Which one is that?
Yes,
I don't have
this is
one
the
here.
one. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we look at data provided by London and Copenhagen, let's say we have data from both expert and then another data from energy utility. So what makes the data identified by expert is better than the state-owned utility? Like shouldn't like state-owned energy utility should provide more data? Like no how to say, they can provide more data as compared to those that has been identified by expert, or because I was
I agree. So the data here at the bottom of Copenhagen is much higher than London because it comes from a company, and it comes directly from an energy company, and they've got measured data. In the case of London, it's one person, an expert, but it's one person's opinion, and they're making a calculation based on incomplete data because they've collated this from different websites and their own knowledge. But we typically say any data owned by a company, particularly an energy company, because they're selling the energy, therefore they will measure how much is being used and how much is generated. They would have much better data. So in the case of Copenhagen, because they own the company and they can get the data directly from the different suppliers, we would assume that is actually very accurate data. Whereas for London, it's an expert, and they're probably very familiar with it, but it's still their assumptions and their thoughts and their opinions, and not hard data. Particularly the load factor, you're assuming, making assumption of how long and how often these plants run, and that can be very variable, and that data is often not made public because it's commercially sensitive. So you're making assumptions here, and anytime you make assumptions, it's going to be less accurate and the quality will be impacted. So data quality increases as we go from London to Mexico City to Copenhagen. Any utility-owned data is always going to be top quality data because they're selling data. They're selling energy. They will measure it accurately because they're making money from it. Whereas this is assuming some calculations for London, and therefore I would always say any energy data from a utility owned from company, whether it's commercial or owned by the public, will have very good data.
Okay, thank you. I think I misunderstood the direction of the data, the direction of the arrow.
Okay, yeah. So the data quality increases as you go down.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
We'll come on to biogenic carbon later on. Then we've got a whole session on that to discuss biogenic carbon, when you report it, when you don't. So I'll park those questions for now. But thanks for the clarification, Deep. But we'll deep dive into that in a future session to really look at what makes up biogenic carbon and what do we include under biogenic carbon, and what comes under fossil carbon. Okay, so let's move into the exercises. So this will take us to the end of today. The next hour and a half will focus on 5 exercises, and at the end you will have completed an inventory for your stationary emissions. Again, may not be entirely accurate, but you'll have completed that part of your inventory. So we'll need your workbook for this, and we're going to go through these 5 questions. The first is, I'm going to ask you in groups to identify all sources of greenhouse gas emissions from energy use in buildings across your city. So this will be a group activity to identify, well, what are the sources of emissions in my city from buildings? So you want to identify all the different building types and where the emissions are coming from. Then a related question is, what fuels are being used? So identify the different fuel types being used in your city. Then number 3, we're then going to actually estimate emissions for scope 1 and scope 2, for 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3 by scaling national data. Step 4, we're then going to put that data into the GPC reporting framework. And step 5, we're going to begin to think around, well, what data should I be collecting myself to improve my inventory, and where could that data come from? So we're going to start to pull together an action plan around how to produce your own updated emissions inventory based on the needs of the GPC. So we'll go through each of these in turn, but these will be your 5 main tasks. So starting with the first one, which is basically identify all the greenhouse gas emission sources from energy use in your buildings across your city. And I want you now to open your workbook. And if you go to your workbook, you've got a tab called Table 1. And in Table 1, you have the following table. So you'll see this table. So if everyone can open their workbook and go to Table 1, and you'll see this table. You've got the subsectors on your left, and then the source of greenhouse gas emissions in the next column. What I want you to do is to simply start filling in those sources in that column, and that could be anything, from energy use for TVs or appliances to fossil coal combustion for a steel industry, for example. So if you can make sure you all have your workbook open, and you open Table 1 called Greenhouse Gas Emission Sources, and you have this table open in your workbook. So, and then I'm going to ask you to start filling this in. So the example I've given here is, for example, electricity for air conditioning, but you can have many other sources. So next I'm going to ask Deep to break you into groups. And within those groups, just have a discussion with what are the different sources of emissions in my city and which subsectors apply to our city. And again, not all subsectors will apply. Some may have manufacturing, some may not have manufacturing, some may have energy industries, others may not have energy industries. Identify which subsectors are relevant to your city, and then basically identify the different activities that result in greenhouse gas emissions and list them in that second column. So before we continue and break out into groups, let me just pause. Are there any questions, or are you all clear on the instructions given? Okay, sounds like you're all clear on those instructions. So in that case, Deep, I'm going to ask you if you can activate the breakout groups, and you'll have 10 minutes to fill in that table and to identify as many sources of emissions as possible that will be taking place across your city. So Deep, I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to you to start the breakout groups.
All right. So everyone, I'm starting to assign you to your breakout rooms.
It looks like we're all back in plenary. Let me just pause for any questions anyone has or anything you'd like to share with the group before we continue.
Everyone, if you have any questions, if you're not sure which source of emissions is under which subsector, right, you can post your questions.
Speak up or use the chat function. Again, we'll plenty of chance to go over this again. But hopefully you had a good chance to identify those main sectors. The air conditioning, heating, cooking, lighting, appliances, schools, public buildings, commercial buildings, industries,
Sorry, Michael, can you unmute yourself? Sorry, I had to mute everyone.
Yes. So if there are any questions, do either use the chat function or speak up. This is a starting point. This is just a starting point to begin to think around what are the emission sources in my city. It's not the end points. There'll be plenty of chances for you to go over that list and modify it, improve it. Hopefully you had a good chance to think around, actually, there are loads of activities across the city that result in greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings is relatively easy. It gets more difficult as we go into transport, waste, and other sectors. But certainly, you know, energy use in homes, electricity, air conditioning, heating, lighting, appliances, cooking, offices, shops, restaurants, public buildings, street lighting, any industries would be the main sources that you'll find in your city. Okay, so having completed that first exercise, we now move on to the next exercise, which is around identifying fuel types. We're running a bit behind schedule, so I'm going to skip this exercise for now. But I'm going to encourage you all to do this at some point over the next weeks after this session. And this really is just a thing to, based upon those emission sources you've identified, think around, well, what are the fuel types that we're using? And fuel types are important because they determine the emissions and what emission factor to use and where to collect the data from. So please spend some time after today's session to identify the fuel types. Go to table 2 in your workbook called fuel types. This is the table that you'll see, and I've given you some suggestions for fuels, and just tick the boxes that apply or write under them which ones are relevant, just to begin to build up a picture of, well, actually, where's the fuel coming from and what fuels are we using. This is a table that you'll see, and then there is a checklist also included in the workbook under reference called checklist, and you'll see this list, and it gives you a list of all the different fuel types that the GPC includes. So beyond the ones that are listed, you may want to consider additional fuel types as well. So again, most of these aren't used beyond the ones I've already included. They're not very common, but nonetheless good for you to think around actually all the possible fuel types that might happen and might be burned within your city. So we have scope 1, which are the fossil fuels or the fossil derived fuels, and scope 2, which is your grid energy. So then simply just go through that table, and for example, on the kerosene is used for cooking, then just, you know, add in cooking, or under LPG, add in, you know, under commercial buildings, you know, used for X, Y, and Z as well. So, or diesel as a backup generator, just begin to add in what are the fuel types and how are they being used. And this is just for your own benefit to really begin to identify, well, where are the emissions coming from? And also, where do I begin to collect the data from? Because the data you're getting for kerosene will be different from the data you're collecting for electricity. So this is an exercise for you to follow up with after today. I would strongly encourage you to do that. So just think about, actually, I've identified the sources, but what fuels are being used in my city? So that's homework for you guys to think about. Okay, so next we're going to start on exercise 2, which is the main exercise for today, and one I'm quite excited to get started on. And we're going to estimate scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for residential buildings, for commercial and institutional buildings, and for manufacturing industries. That should be institutional, not industrial, of course, using national sector data. So I want you to go to the tab called Module C, called Stationary Energy in your workbook. So this is Module C, Stationary Energy in your workbook, and you'll see this table. And it's got a few tables below it, but the top table looks like this. Just to make sure that you're in the right place. So workbook, and then go to your Module C tab, and you'll see this table. I'll come back to this in a second. In addition, you'll need these 3 sources of data. You'll need Berth 3, which is the Malaysia third biannual report to the UNFCCC, which is Malaysia's national inventory report, and tables 1.15 and table A2. You'll need the National Energy Balance Report for 2017 and table 29, and you'll need the 2017 CDM report and table 11. You have those as additional handouts that Deep shared with you this morning, and so please have those open, because we'll be using those as reference materials for the exercise. Now, a quick question. Now, why we're using the National Energy Balance Report 2017 when there was also a 2018 report? So just a question of anyone who'd like to offer an answer, either by unmuting yourself or in the chat function. Knowing that we have a more recent report, why am I still recommending we use the 2017 report for the National Energy Balance data? Why wouldn't I use the latest version available? Why am I using the 2017 version?
The latest emission vectors from 2017 as well.
Yeah, and the BER report is for 2016, the CDM report is for 2017. So you always want to try and get data as close to each other as possible and not pick and choose data from different from different sources. So the BER3 uses 2016 data, indeed. The CDM report is 2017. So to try and make sure that it comes together and we use the same data for similar years is important. So if I used NEB for 2018, then it would be 2 years away from BER, 1 year away from CDM. So try and make sure the data is around the same year as much as possible, which increases the internal consistency and robustness of your calculations. Okay, so then to estimate emissions, as I mentioned, we're going to estimate scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for residential, commercial, and institutional, not industrial, and manufacturing. The preferred sources of data are always local energy use data. Always use local data or energy intensities. They're pretty good data sources. If you can't use those data types, then use national data and scale it to your city boundary. So again, we're using the preferred approach is local data. If we can't, then think of other solutions. In this case, we're going to try and use national data. But you may find that you yourself have access to local data through your energy company, through the ministry. So definitely follow up that. But for now, we're going to use the national data. So we need to scale national data to our city boundary. And what makes a good scaling factor for that? Recognizing we have 3 different subsectors. We have residential, commercial, and institutional, and manufacturing. So what makes a good scaling factor? And that's a decision for you to make. But think of population, number of buildings, GDP, number of companies registered. There are different ways of scaling that data. So don't just assume population as the only one, but try and link the sector to a particular scaling factor that's most representative of that sector and is most likely to change along with emissions from that sector. So that's one assumption we're going to have to make, is find a good scaling factor. The second is we're assuming that emissions do not occur for 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, and 1.7. That's an assumption I've made. That may be wrong, but for now, for the purpose of this exercise, we're not going to estimate those emissions. But if you think they do happen in your city, then you'll need to estimate those emissions yourself. I'm going to assume that you don't have a power station in your city, you don't have big farms or fishing fleets, we don't do non-specified sources, and there are no coal. There's no coal industry taking place in your city either. Fugitive emissions from gas, I'm going to assume are negligible and therefore insignificant. So we're not going to focus on those 5 subsectors. We're just going to focus on 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 for now. So I've made an assumption that may be the right assumption, may be the wrong assumption, but for now that's my assumption, and we'll record it as such. Okay, so the steps we're going to go through to complete this calculation is we're going to identify the fuel types first of all. So what fuel types are being used in my city or are being used in the country? Then we're going to identify the fuel consumption data, how much fuel is being used. If national data, which we are using, I've got to identify a suitable scaling factor. So what is that scaling factor? I'm then going to scale the data to the city boundary to make sure the national data is adjusted to my own city boundary. Next, I'm going to identify the emission factors for the activity data I've calculated, and then I'm going to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. So those are the 6 steps we're going to take. I'm going to take you through today. And this is where the data comes from. So for the fuel types, we're going to use the National Energy Balance Report for 2017 in table 29. And that shows that we're using, in Malaysia, they're using natural gas, LPG, kerosene, petrol, diesel, fuel oil, coal, coke, and electricity. I'm going to find the scaling factor. I'm going to find that from BER3, the third biannual update report. And I'm going to use population for residential and GDP for commercial and the industrial sector. And I'm going to get my emission factors from BER3 as well and from the CDM report. And so I've identified my data sources, and next I'm going to extract those bits of data and complete the calculations. So this is the National Energy Balance Report, table 29. And this is very small here, but you've got a bigger version you can zoom into yourself. And you can see here there's a row called final use, and it's broken down by residential, commercial, and industrial. So those are the three subsectors that we're using. And it then shows you the national consumption of those fuels by fuel type. So these are the fuel types at the top, and it shows you the breakdown by fuel type. So lots of zeros, which means those fuels aren't being used in those sectors. So we're just going to focus on the ones where we do have data, and we're going to record those and convert that, scale that to local data, and convert that into emissions. So that's where we're going to get the activity data from. It's those three rows in table 29. Then for the scaling factors, I'm going to use table 1.15 in BER3, and I'm going to use population data for 2016, which is this 31.6 million, and GDP for 2016 as well. So I'm going to use those two bits of data as a scaling factor, and I'm going to use my own city's data for that as well. So you have your own city population data, your own city GDP. If you don't have them to hand, make an assumption, but to scale them, we're going to use the national data points and your city data points to identify a scaling factor. But these are the national data points. If you don't have your own city data, or if you're not a city, if you're a national government, then I'd suggest you use KL's data. And again, this is from KL's 2017 inventory, so it's the right year. And this is from the GPC. They submitted to C40 and to CDP, so it's public data. And they have population for KL, they have GDP for KL, and area for KL. So using these two, we can identify the scaling factors for KL. So again, if you don't have data for your own city, you can use KL, or if you're not a city, you can use KL's data as well. One thing to note though is the BER3 reports GDP in the local currency, and KL reports it into GDP. And here's the conversion factor. It's 1 RM is equal to 0.24 US dollars. So we can then convert that into RM, so we can use the same currencies to do that calculation. Then we're going to get emission factors from BER3 table A2, and you can see they've listed all the fuel types here. And again, just use the top of the table, just the fuel types here at the top left, and you've got the different columns for CO2, CH4, and N2O. And they give you the emission factor in terms of tons of the fuel per terajoule of energy. Important to note here is that CH4 and N2O haven't been yet converted to CO2 equivalent, so we'll need to make sure we do that conversion using the global warming potential factor to convert those gases into CO2 equivalent. Also important to note is that the emission factor for CO2 is in tons of carbon per terajoule and not tons of CO2 per terajoule. So we need to convert that from tons of carbon to tons of CO2. For the emission factor for electricity, we're using the CDM report table 11, which gives us a emission factor for electricity for Peninsular Malaysia, which is 0.585 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. Important to note, this only has CO2. It's not CO2e, therefore it doesn't include methane or nitrous oxide, which do occur in trace amounts. But the only data I could find was this report, and it only includes emissions from CO2. So the question then is, well, what about methane and nitrous oxide? The GPC does require me to report those, but I can only find an emission factor that includes carbon dioxide and doesn't include methane or nitrous oxide. So there are two ways of solving this. Well, three ways. One is to find a better emission factor. I did a quick Google search. There may be other sources, but this is a fairly good source. So there may be a source that does have that. If it has, then use that. You could also look at other emission factors and say actually methane is 0.01% typically of electricity, and nitrous oxide typically say 0.05%, and apply those percentages to your emission factor. So you basically you're developing an additional emission factor for methane and nitrous oxide. Or, and this is what we're going to be doing, we'll just report CO2, but make it very clear that we haven't included methane or nitrous oxide. So there will be a comment somewhere in our report that says, for electricity, we only measured CO2 emissions because we couldn't find another emission factor. That's fine. Again, the key thing here is transparency. Methane and nitrous oxide would be fairly small in comparison to CO2 anyway. So it would be fine to say it's not being included. It won't have a material impact on your inventory, but it would be more complete with. But if it isn't in there, then just be transparent. Say, look, the emission factor doesn't include CO2 from methane and nitrous oxide. But there's a comment here from Deep. If one of the that one of the organizations can actually comment on the emission factor to see actually if methane or oxide has been included. From what I can see, it doesn't report CO2 either. For the assumption would be it is just CO2, but we can perhaps have that answered either on this call or by the next session. For now, we're assuming it doesn't include methane or nitrous oxide, but we can address that later on. Okay, so then what are the calculations we're going to be doing? So we know that to estimate greenhouse gas emissions, we multiply activity data by an emission factor. But we have all these different units. We have kilograms, we have CO2e, we have kilotons of oil equivalent, we have tons of carbon, terajoules, megawatt hours, all these different units, and I'm confused. Because I know I can't multiply different units together, so I need to do some conversions. So the activity data is in kilotons of oil equivalent. The emission factors are in tons of carbon per terajoule or tons of CO2 per megawatt hour, and for methane and nitrous oxide, they're in terms of kilograms of those gases per terajoule. So we need to do some conversion first before we can do the calculations. And so these are our conversions. So we convert activity data from kilotons of oil equivalent to terajoules using a conversion factor. We convert emission factors for CO2 from tons of carbon per terajoule to tons of CO2 per terajoule. And we convert emission factors for methane and nitrous oxide from kilograms per terajoule to tons per terajoule. And we convert the tons of CH4 and N2O to CO2 equivalent using the global warming potential factor. So quite a few conversions we need to do to estimate our emissions. And this, beyond sourcing data, this takes up the most amount of time. It's just getting the data in the right format with the right units to make sure we can do these calculations. So a quick look here. To convert activity data from kilotons of oil equivalent to terajoules, we multiply by 41.868. That's the conversion factor to go from KTOE to terajoules, 41.868. To convert from tons of carbon per terajoule to tons of CO2 per terajoule, we multiply by the molecular weight of CO2 over carbon, and that is 44 over 12. So if you basically, carbon is just one molecule. If we add 2 oxygen molecules, we add an extra 32 units of molecular weight, and therefore we basically adjust the weight of CO2 compared to carbon, and it's multiplied by 44 over 12. And to convert the emission factors from methane and nitrous oxide from kilograms per terajoule to tons per terajoule, we divide by 1,000, and then we multiply by the global warming potential factor to get to CO2e equivalent. So those are the conversions we'll be making for the primary fuels, the fossil fuels. For electricity, the emission factor is in tons of CO2 per megawatt hour, and to convert that into terajoules, we multiply by 0.0036. Now, these conversion factors are very easy to access. You just go into an online search engine, you go megawatt hours, terajoules, and it will give you these conversion factors. So don't be scared off. There's a search engine there that will find you the answer very, very quickly. The key thing, though, is that we do convert these units so we can calculate them and we don't mix them up, because that can really cause some very confusing numbers in your inventory, because it's quite easy to get one of these wrong and you're multiplying it rather than dividing it, or you should have divided it by 1,000 and suddenly your emissions are 10 million rather than 10,000, for example. So very, very important to be aware of the units, but always use a search engine just to double check, have I got the right numbers? Have I got the right units? Okay, so these are your tasks, and we're going to break up for 30 minutes to go through this exercise. So you've got quite a bit of time to go through these calculations. These are the steps, and I'm going to take you through these steps one by one. So the first step is to convert your kilotons of oil equivalent, basically to copy the data from the National Energy Balance Report into your workbook, then to convert that data into terajoules by multiplying by 41.868. Then we copy the data in terajoules into table from table 1A to table 1B. We then identify a suitable scaling factor, either population or GDP. We copy the national data from BER3, table 1.15. Then we record our own city value for population or GDP, or we use KL's data as default. We then find the ratio between the two, and we then multiply the national activity data by the ratio to get our city data. We then find the emission factors from BER3, table A2. We then convert the one for CO2 from carbon to carbon dioxide by multiplying by 44/12. We then convert the ones for methane or nitrous oxide from kilograms to tons by dividing by 1,000. And we convert the one for electricity per megawatt hour to per terajoule by multiplying by 0.0036. We then multiply the activity data by the emission factor, and then apply the global warming potential factors to methane and nitrous oxide. And finally, we sum them all together. So these are the steps we're going to go through. I'll keep this slide on. You've got the slide as well as a separate handout to have all the, so you have all the steps listed. But I'm going to take you through one example and then hand over to you to complete the exercise. Okay, so we're going to do a demonstration with natural gas. If you can follow me, if you can open your workbook to module 3, that will be great. And then just follow me as we do the exercise. So you should have this table in front of you right now. Module C, stationary energy, under table 1A, we're going to copy data from the National Energy Balance Report 2017. Just a quick reference. So I'm going to have the table copied on the main screen. Then at the top left, you're going to see the cell reference number, so you can follow exactly where I'm moving my cursor. And the formula I need you to type into the cell will be covered in that second big red circle. So just follow those instructions. And then I'll do one example, and then I'm going to hand over to you to complete the rest. So first up, I'm going to record the activity data. So I'm going to go into the National Energy Balance Report, table 29. I'm going to look at the kilotons of oil equivalent data for natural gas under commercial and institutional, and that is 25 kilotons of oil equivalent. So have a look at the table, find the second line, which is commercial, and then find natural gas, and you'll see, which is the first column, and you'll see it's 25 kilotons of oil equivalent. So that's the first step we've done, is we've copied the data from one into our table. Next, we're going to convert that to terajoules by multiplying it by 41.868. So we multiply 25 by 41.868, which gives 1,047 terajoules of natural gas. So then we're going to copy the data into the table below. So from table 1.A, we copy that activity data into table 1B under the same subsector and the same fuel type, in this case 1,047 terajoules. We're then going to identify a scaling factor. In this case, it's commercial, therefore it's mostly focused on GDP as a good scaling factor, so we select GDP as our scaling factor. Next, we copy the national data, and this is the figure from BER3 report, the GDP in 2016 for Malaysia. This is in millions. We then copy the city value. I've used KL's data, which was in dollars. So therefore, I've divided by 0.24 to get to RM, and I get my number there below. So I'm going to record the city value for GDP. I'm then going to divide the city value by the national value to find the ratio, which is 0.2 in this case. And I'm then going to multiply the ratio by the activity data to get my city data. So I'm going to multiply 1,047 by 0.2, which is the ratio, to get 205 as the activity data for my city boundary. So I've adjusted the national data for the city boundary. So please do copy these data points in your workbook as we go along. Okay, so that's steps 1A and 1B completed. Then in step 1C, we then copy the emission factor from BER 3 into the table. So this is, in the case for natural gas, the emission factor is 15.3. So I copy that across. I do the same for methane and the same for nitrous oxide. So emission factor of 1 for methane and 0.1 for nitrous oxide. So I've recorded the emission factors in my table. Next, I want to convert them into the units that I'm looking for. So I'm going to convert the tons of carbon per terajoule to tons of CO2 by terajoule. And I do that by multiplying the tons of carbon figure by 44 over 12 to get 56.1. I then want to convert my methane figure per kilogram of methane per terajoule to tons of methane per terajoule by dividing by 1,000. So I divide that by 1,000. And I do the same for nitrous oxide. I divide the emission factor by 1,000 to get tons of nitrous oxide per terajoule. Okay, so I've recorded the emission factor here for natural gas. A quick side step for electricity. What I want you to do is don't worry about the grayed out cells. Just record your emission factor in the one green cell at the bottom and multiply the data from the CDM report by 0.0036 to have that in tons of CO2 per terajoule. So we multiply that by 0.0036. Okay, so then final step is we actually multiply the data to get our emissions. So we multiply the activity data for our city from table 1B by the emission factor in table 1C. So I'm now in cell C80 for natural gas, and I'm going to multiply H34, which is the emission factor, by D56, which is the activity data, the H34 is the activity data, and D56 is the emission factor. I'm going to multiply them together to get total emissions for CO2. I'm going to do the same for methane to get tons of methane, but I need to then convert that, and same for nitrous oxide to get tons of nitrous oxide. I then need to convert those to CO2 equivalent by multiplying them by their global warming potential factor. And so I multiply the tons of CH4 by 25 to get 5.12. And I multiply 0.02 by 6.1 by 298 to get 6.11. Those are my different gases. I then subtotal the gases. So I add all of those three up to get my total emissions for natural gas, in this case for Kuala Lumpur, which is 11,506 tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's the calculation steps I would like you to go through. Very sequential, step by step to do those calculations. So these are all the steps. I'm going to leave this on the screen. Again, you have this as a handout as well. So if you need to refer back to this, you've got the columns here that you need to refer to. But follow these instructions. I'm going to ask you to work on this individually, just on your own. But if you do have a question, then either chat to a colleague or ask me. I'm in plenary. Either speak up or add a question to the chat function. But if you can, actually, I'm going to reduce it to 25 minutes to make sure we have enough time for discussion. So you've got 25 minutes until 15:15. We'll continue this exercise. If you finish early, take a break. If not, then just continue, and then we'll work until 15:15, and then we'll go through the answers. But if you need a break, a toilet break, a coffee break, take one now and then start the exercise. But yeah, plan to share your answers at 15:15. But any questions in the meantime, use the chat function or just speak up. I'll be here as well to answer any questions or take you through some of those answers. So before I continue, let me just check, are there any further questions?
Michael, are we breaking to breakout rooms or no?
No, we'll do this in plenary. So if everyone can just work individually, and again, if you have any questions, use the chat function or use just speak up. And if you need a quick break, then please do take a break to go to toilet or to stretch your legs or grab a drink or otherwise. But otherwise, we'll be back at 1:45. And then we'll go through the time to reconvene. So everyone can stop what they're doing and rejoin the plenary session, please. I hope you found that exercise useful. It really comes down to the core of what an inventory compiler is, and I've added some comments in the chat box. But you're sourcing data, you're a detective, you're finding different data sources you can use to compile your inventory. Then you're an investigator, you're fitting that data to your needs, you're converting the units, you're scaling the data, you're really kind of fitting it to what you need it for. And then finally, you're an accountant, you're doing the calculations and reporting data in the different formats required by the GPC. So it requires lots of different skill sets. But the key thing is you're always trying to solve a problem. There's never perfect data. You're always trying to find different data from different sources. There's no emission factor for electricity in one report. Therefore, let's find another report. That data doesn't fit my boundary. Can I scale it using what data? You're always trying to solve a problem. You're always trying to find different ways of getting the best data available for your inventory. So this exercise, what I really wanted you to understand is you can use data from different sources. You can scale data, but always very often be careful about the units, because that's what really gets people to make mistakes. It's reporting different units and not converting them properly, and not recognizing that data won't always be available in the perfect format you need it in. So you need to adjust it either by transforming the units or by scaling the data. So just be good to. So we've gone through all of these. So just be good to maybe just get some comments from all of you, just a few of you at least, on what you thought of the exercise, whether you have any questions or any things you'd like some further clarification on. So we've got a few minutes to answer any questions you might have. And I know it's late in the day, so I know you're all ready to go home. Any questions? Did everyone finish the exercise? If you can maybe let me know in the chat function if anyone managed to finish the whole exercise, if you managed to make if there's still some emissions left to calculate.
Michael,
Yes.
I have a question. In our city, the district cooling is using the natural gas.
Mm-hmm.
So the only the commercial, which is the 1.2 subsectors, is using this natural gas to cooling purposes. So if I get the data from the utility provider for the natural gas consumption, I should put it as the subsector 1.2 or under the energy industry's consumption emissions.
So for the energy used for, to measure the energy that it depends. If it's part of a network that is just within the city, if it's a small cooling network, then it would go under 1.2.1. If it's a small network. If it's part of a regional network with other neighboring towns and etc., then it comes under 1.4.4. So depending upon the size of the network, if it's a small cooling network that is just connecting a few different buildings, then you report it as the energy consumed within the city. If it's part of a broader network that runs across multiple towns and cities and areas, then you report it under 1.4.4, and then the consumption of the cooling under 1.2.2. So it depends very much how big the network is, but I would imagine it would cover just a couple of buildings. It would just be a intercity network, and in that case, you would just report it under 1.2.1.
Yeah, it is only for the our own cities purposes. That's why we call it a district cooling system. So the data comes from the cooling plants. So every
Yes.
year, yeah, we'll get the aggregate data for the natural gas consumption from these plants. Then we'll actually disaggregate it into the government buildings as well as the commercial building, because we have two types of the main building types here. So I think this approach is acceptable, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. No, that's perfectly sensible approach.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so what I'm going to basically ask you to, once you've completed, if you haven't completed it yet, then please take some time today, tomorrow to complete it. And if everyone can send me their completed workbook before Wednesday, then I can have a look through that to see if there's any and give you some feedback. So also picking up on your point, Deep, yeah, if you can send your completed workbooks for stationary energy to Deep, he can then share those with me and I'll go through them in advance of our next webinar so I can give you feedback on your calculations. So then quickly moving on to the next task. Just went through these, which is basically to record your data into table 3. There's a table 3 in your workbook under tables, table 3 called GPC. And this basically looks like the GPC reporting framework. So it looks like this, where you have your different subsectors and your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And what I would like you to do is to complete this table, either with emissions data or with a notation key. So just as an example here, and these numbers are made up, so don't copy them. But I've recorded emissions for scope 1 residential buildings as nearly 1.5 million tons, and for scope 2 nearly 2.3 million tons. I didn't estimate scope 3, so I recorded NE as a notation key under scope 3. So if you can all please now update table 3 in your workbook using both emissions data that you've calculated for those first 3 sectors, so for 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, and use notation keys for the other subsectors, either NE, NO, IE, or confidential, the ones we went through last time. So if you can spend sort of 5 minutes now to complete that first table under table 3, which is table 3 covers all the sectors. Just focus on the residential, on the stationary energy sector, and if you can just very quickly complete that table with either data or a notation key, and either use NE for not estimated, NO for not occurring, IE for included elsewhere, or C for confidential. So you've got 5 minutes now to quickly complete that table 3 in your workbook. Okay, so let's join back again. We've got a few minutes left. So hopefully you've all been able to complete that table. And if you have, and forgetting whether data is accurate or not, but if you have, then congratulations, because that's an inventory. And that's your first sort of GPC inventory. It's when you report data for where you have data and activities occur, and you report notation keys where emissions don't occur or you don't have data. So congratulations. We'll go over the calculations in turn, and if you can share with me your workbooks before Wednesday, I can go through that. Just a comment on Deep's question. I think the issue there is the conversion between megawatt hours and terajoules, which should be a division, not a multiplication. That should then reverse that calculation. But if you can all, if you haven't yet finished the exercise, please do so at home or at work tomorrow, and then send them to me or send them to Deep to share with me before Wednesday. I'll then have a look and I can give you feedback. But that's essentially what's involved in compiling an inventory and reporting a GPC emissions inventory. You're collating data from different sources, you're transforming that data, you're calculating emissions, and then you're converting that data or transferring that data into the GPC reporting template, and not leaving blanks where there is no data, but rather using a notation key to document why there is no data for those sectors. In the tab in the workbook, you'll see there are some additional columns to the right, which look at data quality, look at the data sources and the methodologies. Please do also complete those, and we'll go through those next time as well, because that is important. That is part of an inventory, is to be transparent around your sources and your methodologies, and that's contained in additional cells in Cirrus as well, to make sure that in addition to the data, there's also transparency around methodologies and sources. So we didn't get time to focus on question 5, but question 5 is essentially, and this is for you to think about, and again, this is for you in your own time, use table 4 in the workbook to identify what data and emission factors you will need to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. So this is in table 4 under action plan in your workbook, and it looks like this: subsector, data, where from, action, and lead. So this is the same table here, and simply start to populate that. So for example, I need to obtain electricity use data from the Ministry of Environment. My action is to request an informal meeting to discuss what data they have, and the lead is Mrs. Jones, for example. So just look at what data you think you need based on your previous inventories, but also your current knowledge, and begin to pull together an action plan for updating or compiling your GPC inventory. So what we did today is what I call a default inventory. It's using national data. It's a correct inventory, but there may be ways of making it more accurate using more local data. But it's a good starting point, either to fill in blanks or to validate data obtained in other ways. So please do complete this action plan as well. We'll come back to this later on in the session, looking at all the sectors and compiling all the steps that you want to take on after this webinar series. So please do document those for now, but there will be a chance to revisit this exercise during one of the later sessions. Okay, so that's everything for today. We covered we looked at the sector and the different subsectors. We then looked at how to report emissions from fuel combustion, from fugitive emission sources, and from grid supplied energy. We looked at a few case studies, and we started a practical exercise to actually calculate emissions and populate a GPC reporting framework. So we're now on to our 4th topic, which is on on transportation. So we'll focus on that next time. But before that, we'll just revisit this exercise on the webinar on Wednesday before we deep dive into transportation. So with that, I'll hand over to Deep, or for any further questions that you might have.
Thanks, Michael.